Well, now we come to what we've all been waiting for, our featured speaker. It's now my great honor and pleasure to introduce the presenter for the Founders Memorial Award. The Founders Memorial Award was established in 1958 to honor the memory of those scientists who have made outstanding contributions to entomology. Dr. Carol Anelli, professor and interim chair of the Department of Entomology at The Ohio State University, has been selected to deliver the Founders Memorial Award lecture at this meeting, and she will be featuring Dr. Anna Botsford Comstock. Dr. Anelli is the fourth woman to be awarded the Founders Memorial Award lecture, and Anna Comstock is the third woman honoree. This is the first time, however, where both the lecturer and the honoree are women. I would like to thank the Early Career Professionals Committee, who worked so hard on the nomination. And so congratulations to you, ECP Committee, for a job well done. Now, Dr. Anelli's career in entomology spans more than 4 decades. You're such a young thing, Carol. You must have started in kindergarten. She is renowned as a researcher and educator. Her research achievements include publications of highly impactful refereed articles and book chapters spanning insect physiology and the discipline of science education methods. She has received multiple awards for her teaching, including ESA's Distinguished Achievement Award in Teaching in 2009. Prior to joining The Ohio State, Dr. Anelli served on the faculty for 17 years at Washington State University as a professor of entomology and later as faculty fellow in the Office of Assessment of Teaching and Learning. She is deeply versed in the history of entomology, and her early career briefly took her to the same grounds that were once home to Anna Comstock, when she spent the summer of 1990 as an historical and archival research associate for Dr. Edward Smith, Emeritus Professor of Entomology at Cornell. Ladies and gentlemen, it is truly my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carol Anelli. And you get your award after, so don't run off the podium.
Thank you. Good morning. So I have a little laryngitis because it wouldn't be exciting otherwise. Thank you so much. Wow, you wonderful entomologists up early after a night of mixers, perhaps late night reveling, and it might have involved a little alcohol. I got a very good night's sleep, so I don't know why I'm hoarse. I am so deeply honored by this award and humbled, and I must say daunted by the task of, pardon me, of doing justice to Anna Botsford Comstock, and here's why. It's a sensitive toucher here. When Anna died in 1930, the Ithaca Journal News printed an obituary that said in part it would be, or actually it was an editorial, said in part it would be difficult to say whether Anna was better known as an author, a teacher, or an artist. And I think we're somehow on automatic, which we don't want. Can we fix that? I think we're in it's in a timing mode. Isn't this fun? Years of teaching and people that do extension work know that this happens inevitably no matter how much you try. Do we think we're okay now? Okay, well, let me see if I can go back. So, those 3 realms in which Anna worked as a best-selling author, as an innovative educator, as we'll see, and as an illustrator and quite accomplished artist are what I'd like to talk to you about this morning. So I'll take each of these as we go along. And hopefully my slides won't get ahead of me. So, now they don't want to go. Okay. So we're going to start at the beginning. Anna was born in 1854 in Cattaraugus County, New York, in a very rural farming community. She was born in a log house, actually. And her parents, Phoebe and Marvin Botsford, really valued education. And her mother was very much a nature lover and instilled in Anna this love of nature. She taught Anna at a very young age the names of dozens of flowers and the constellations in the sky and so forth. So her parents were absolutely valued education, sent her to a very good elementary school. At the age of 13, she moved to this house in Otto, New York. And just so you know, a lot of the materials I'll be showing you today are from Cornell's rare and manuscripts collections, and so I'm very grateful to them for that. Now, after her schooling at elementary school, at the age of 17, Anna moved herself boarded to this school, the Chamberlain Institute in Randolph. This was about 18 miles away. When she graduated 2 years later, it was a preparatory school. She gave her salutatorian speech in Latin. I don't know how many people actually understood it. But she was already an experienced educator because when she was 14 years old, she taught for the regular school teacher in Otto who had taken ill. So at this point in her life, she writes to Cornell University, and it's so small, there are only been admitting students for about 6 years at that point. She gets a letter back direct from President Andrew White, who also included a pre-printed circular that's addressed Dear Sir, which kind of tells us about who's attending universities at that time in our history. She decides to go to Cornell. She has to live in off-campus housing because there's no women's dorm yet. It's being constructed. It was then known as Sage College. She becomes very fast a personal friend of President White, known for his vast library. You see him way in the back of this big room with those thousands of volumes of books in that red circle. So she was allowed, she took his course in Reformation history, but she also was permitted to borrow books from his personal library. In 1875, in the spring, her first semester at school, she met John Henry Comstock. He was teaching zoology. She took that course. She later took his entomology courses. Oh, and excuse me, by the lower right photo, that is the two arrowheads are John Henry Comstock and Anna Botsford. And you'll notice that they're both proudly displaying their insect butterfly nets. And clearly, this was portending what was to come to be of their many years together as partners in our discipline. Now, they started having dinners at Sage College together, and the reason was that there were so few women boarding at Sage that Sage College invited men to come in and share. And share, I'm glad that worked. Uh-oh, we're back in auto again, so I don't know why that's happening. I apologize, because I'm not touching anything. But anyway, maybe I'll just leave it there. Thank you. So they start hiking in the fabulous gorges of campus, and then in 1878, they're married. Now, John Henry had already purchased land on the campus, and it's in that circle. You see how I'm not touching anything? Should I pause? What shall we do? This is where I'm supposed to know some good jokes. I don't know any good jokes. Let me pick up where we were. So, by happenstance of the fact that there aren't a lot of women, this young couple starts having their dinners together at Sage. They sit together. They get wed They're wedded in 1878. John Henry already had this land on campus. They build this house, which they called a cottage, Fall Creek Cottage overlooking Fall Creek. I'm afraid to touch this. But don't look for that house now because it's gone. It's Baker Lab. Okay, year after they're married. Oh, and I'm sorry. There's all kinds of stuff going on in my head. I want to point out here that I think that John Henry was an early feminist. Look at this quote from Anna's autobiography. We worked together then as later. He used to help me wash the dishes, and I used to go to the laboratory and help him. And we're going to see John Henry giving her recognition. We have to understand that this was not done at that time for women. They typically worked in the shadow of men. and weren't given credit for their work. Okay, now, a year after their marriage, the couple moves to Washington, D.C., taking over, John Henry was, as chief entomologist for the federal government, for the U.S. government, and they're in this building that's no longer there, but it was on the mall, the old agricultural department. And on the second floor of this building that I'm showing you at the lower left, a floor plan for it, the area that's outlined in red were where the entomology rooms were, and the yellow, that big expanse, was a museum that had many display cases of glass-fronted displays. Now, Anna's was actually paid for her work, again, unusual at the time, and she started doing drawings for what would become John Henry Comstock's reports as the federal entomologist in 1880-81. And so you're seeing one here that I bet a lot of the systematists in the audience know what that is. Note that in the preface to those reports, John Henry Comstock gave Anna credit for her work. Now, at this time, Anna also learns, she's handling insects and such, but she also learns how to run this newfangled device, the typewriter, purportedly the second one purchased by the USDA. Now, they were only there 2 years because John Henry had replaced C.V. Riley, the mercurial C.V. Riley. See Don Weber if you want more information. And so, when there was a change in administration at the federal level, the presidential level, John Henry was out and C.V. Riley was back. So they go back to Cornell. Now, at this time, any of you that have been in a two-career couple know how hard it is for everyone to do what they want to do. This was no exception, and of course, think about it. It's 1881. You know, if you're going to eat, you're cooking it yourself. You're doing everything yourself, right? Well, there's this wonderful letter from Anna to William Trelease, and my friends at the University of Illinois will know that name. And here it is. Did you know that Henry and I have a new wife? My cousin, Helen Willits, is the victim. She cooks Anna's humor. She cooks our dinner, sews our buttons, mends our gloves, and in short, is the goddess of our domestic life. I can still work with Harry. That was a pet name for John Henry. And we have our home life, too. So Anna, remember, her career had been interrupted as getting her degree. Well, she does complete her degree in 1885, a Bachelor of Science in Natural History. Now, around this time, afraid to touch it, but I want to advance. Okay. You're going to see in the next few slides, there were a lot of world fairs and world expositions. So Anna submits her drawings in 1885, dare I hold this, to New Orleans, and she gets first honorable mention for her scientific drawings. Now, she writes in her autobiography, it's a wonderful book, she writes that this really inspires her to take up engraving, wood engraving, with renewed vigor. And it's because John Henry wants her not just to do drawings, but to do engravings for what will become his introduction to entomology that was published in 1888. And you'll notice that he gives her credit on the front and in the preface. Now, we know from Anna's autobiography that was published posthumously a little bit of the background about how she came to do this. She ordered the wood engraving tools and an instruction booklet, and then she writes, "With my usual daring on untried paths, I went at it." Now, I don't know about you, but you know, I could have all the daring in the world, I wouldn't be able to produce this. This is one of her remarkable, breathtaking woodcut prints. This was dedicated and given to Martha Van Rensselaer, and we'll hear more about her in a little bit. Now, at this point, I want to just explain as best I can, a totally lacking in artistic abilities person, how wood engraving works. So you can follow along with the numbers. The artist first begins with the block of wood, paints it so that the person can then pencil in the picture that's going to be engraved. And then this is all maneuvered on a leather sandbag. So you're maneuvering around the sandbag while you're engraving, holding the engraver in the palm of your hand. And there are different engravers for making different size lines. And then you carve, this is measured in hours and weeks, if not days, days if not weeks. When it's completely finished, at step 5, when you have the completed block, it gets inked and then printed to paper, and that'll be the mirror image of the block. And so it's a kind of relief printing. Now, they have Anna's tools at Cornell, and I just want to say that she started on her own, but then she, in her innovative, bold way, takes off for 6 weeks to live in Greenwich Village. She boards in a boarding house so that she can study with the masters at Cooper Union, which is still there. This is a very respected art institute. These are people, I don't have time to go into it, but if you know about engraving, this was a school, wood engraving, this was a school that was very much iconoclast. They were upending the normal rules of engraving and saying, we're going to do it this way instead of the old way. Very non-traditional. Now, in 1890, Anna arranges, she's by now an elected member of the Society of American Wood Engravers, and she, in 1890, arranges for their proofs, the prints of their work, to be shown at Cornell's entomology department. So culture way back then at the entomology department, because that's who we are as entomologists. Anyway, Cornell's entomology department was then located in Whitehall, and these were prints that had been previously sent to the Universal Exposition in Paris the year before. 1893, there's another world event. This one's in Chicago. She takes her parents to see her. She had submitted 6 prints from wood engravings, and she wrote about this in her autobiography. She wrote about the thrill of seeing her Moonlight Sonata and many of her moths and butterflies hung with the work of the great masters. Hundreds of people who were wood engravers had submitted their work. But she said when it came time to giving out the awards, the judges eliminated her work and that of the banknote engravers because it was specialized. And in this wonderful magnanimous sentence, she says, I thought this fair enough. Now here is this gorgeous print of hers, a Moonlight Sonata, also at Cornell. Now, in 1895, they published their co-authored book, A Manual of the Study of Insects. This would become a classic, a standard for decades, a standard textbook. This went through, I don't know, 22 editions, I believe. You'll note that she is a co-author, and you'll note that John Henry in the preface acknowledges her, not just her work with the pencil engraver, meaning the illustrations, but also her work from her pen. She co-wrote this book with him. We get something of the sense of this power couple and how dedicated and assiduous they were with their work. This came out in 1895. In 1893, right after commencement at Cornell, as she says in her autobiography, here, you can pick it up somewhere from a used bookstore. She wrote that John Henry would get up as usual. He would get up at 4 in the morning to work uninterrupted for a couple of hours when school was in session. Anyway, he got up early. They took 2 weeks on Cayuga Lake in a cottage, and that's all they did was work for those 2 weeks. And you can see that she's engraving for 9 hours a day. They did take a bike ride for recreation at the end of the day. 1901, there was another one of these big expositions. Anna gets first award for her engravings of insects. And you can tell by the lower photo that the big the big innovation that year technologically was electricity, powered in this case by the nearby Niagara Falls, because this was at Buffalo, New York. You might also remember, history buffs, that this was the exposition where President McKinley was assassinated. Eye candy. I'll note here that Anna was the 3rd woman elected to the American Society of Wood Engravers. It's just breathtaking work. Here's another pair. The one on the left is dedicated to Professor Liberty Hyde Bailey and his wife. We'll hear more about him in a moment. The one on the right was in a manual for the study of insects. Their co-authored work. Now, at this time in history, the US, believe it or not, is employing hundreds of wood engravers, of engravers in general, because that was the medium of choice for illustrations by publishers. You know, that was what publishers wanted. But then came the advent of halftones. And this is a process you're familiar with on the right, those little dots with different sizes and spacing that our eye puts together as an image. Now, Anna gave an interview, I think she was out in California, gave an interview on halftones. And you can imagine after seeing her work why she was horrified by the prospect of this and what it might mean for wood engraving. The point here that she made in the interview, though, was that the expense of wood engraving, because you're having to pay for someone to do this for hours and weeks, was $2 to $4 a square inch versus halftones, which were 5 cents. Okay, let's turn to Anna's second realm, the nature study movement. Now, once again, we're going to find her treading with her usual daring on untried paths. This movement lasted about 40 years in the United States. There's a voluminous set of scholarly work on this, if you haven't heard about it. And we need a little bit of historical context. At the time, in 1890 to 93, the country was in the throes of an agricultural depression. And what this meant were people were fleeing the rural areas and the farms for the cities, for employment in the cities. The nature study movement arose as an answer to this problem. And the idea was, it was in part a pedagogy, like experiential learning, hands-on learning. The idea was you could take advantage of a child's natural curiosity about nature, help them hone their children's powers of observation, and this would result in an increased appreciation for science and a better scientific knowledge and life skills that they would apply as they went through life. Cornell University and the University of Chicago were the intellectual centers of this movement. So those professors were developing curricula and such to teach the teachers to teach the children. And this spawned a proliferation of nature clubs across the US. These are these sweet little children, the bird lovers clubs with their bird boxes. A bunch of educational pamphlets, many of them by Anna Botsford, as you're seeing here in the lower right, but also clubs, the Junior Naturalist Monthly, and they had their pamphlets, and then curricula that would come out of this. And in fact, by 1921, nearly every state in the Union had nature study as part of its curriculum, embedded. Now, at Cornell, the leader of this movement was Liberty Hyde Bailey, and Cornellians know that name. You see him here. He and Anna became fast friends, and he asked her to please help him in this undertaking. This was how she became, in 1898, Cornell's first woman of faculty rank. Now, as an assistant professor. That was short-lived for a little bit of time there, several years actually. They reduced her to a lecturer the following year, if I can use the word reduce, which I hate. But she was back to being a lecturer because the Board of Trustees raised a stink. So finally in 1913, they recognized the errors of their ways. She was again an assistant professor and then did rise to become a full professor at Cornell. Not so long before she retired, however. She also, by the way, became chair of the Nature Study Department, which she was, inaugurated. She developed that program there. Now, as I've mentioned, there's a lot of scholarly literature on this. So there are books by, for example, the very distinguished science historian Sally Gregory Kolstad. That's her book on the left. And then all of this literature, you will see Anna Botsford Comstock's name in because the historians recognize her as a founder of this movement. And many such historians have done so regarding Anna. So, Liberty Hyde Bailey and Anna Botsford Comstock developed the Nature Studies Summer School at Cornell. This was a group photo in 1900s of these happy teachers out in nature. And at the arrowhead, you're seeing, leftmost, John Henry Comstock. Seated next to him, the younger Liberty Hyde Bailey. Behind them is Anna Botsford Comstock. Anna recognized that teachers needed help teaching about nature. So she published curricula like this syllabus of lectures, and in this little pamphlet, she outlined the advantages of nature study for the student, what it did for the student. But she also acknowledged that teachers were going to have trouble teaching, and so she pointed out, but we can grapple with these problems, and here are the solutions. And here, importantly, are the advantages to the teacher as well, who's teaching nature study. Now, in the course of this, she really had a large extension component as well to her work. So she had developed this voluminous correspondence with people, teachers, writing in, asking for advice. This is one that she's written to someone after she's retired. So she does this for like 25 to 30 years, probably more like 30. She says, I hope you will write me concerning your work and tell me how you're getting along. If there's anything that I can do for you, please let me know. Now, in 1897, Insect Life came out by John Comstock. And Anna writes in her autobiography that she realized that teachers really needed a special book, teachers and novices. And so they would give them help in reading the facts of nature. So she prevails upon John Henry to do this book. And she writes in her autobiography, and here's Insect Life, where she's again given credit for her work. She writes in her autobiography that this was the first time she tried her hand at engraving landscapes. And again, they're just breathtaking. These are all from Insect Life. And the one on the upper right, by the way, it's you can see the grasshopper she calls locust, perched on the dandelion. A breathtaking woodcut from Insect Life of the Io moth. Okay, so now, in 1911, doing well, time-wise, in 1911, Anna's Handbook of Nature Study was published. And those who know of her work probably know of her because of this. I want to read you a little quote from her autobiography about this work. My husband, who had so heartily and generously backed me in my former undertakings, was most discouraging. He said the book would never pay for the printing. I disagreed with the judgment of my friends and family. I believed that the book would pay for itself after several years. By the way, it's printed on glazed paper. It's very heavy. There's a copy down in the exhibit hall. Mr. Hahn is selling it, if it's still there. Anyway, so I thought it would pay for itself after several years, and I felt that I could not let all the hard work I had done for teachers be lost. So I went at my task with defiant courage. You go, Anna. She writes that she put every spare moment into writing and getting this thing done. It was an immediate success. It's considered a classic, still apparently selling at Cornell. I went through 24 editions, published in 8 languages, comes in at over 900 pages, 100 or so of which are about insects, still in print. And you can see by now there's a lot of use of photographs in here, because that's the next technological printing advance. Although to Anna, despite its being 900 pages, she said it does not contain more than any intelligent country child of 12 should know of his environment. How's that for a challenge? I'll mention here that her earlier work, Ways of the Six-Footed, was very popular among elementary school teachers. Now, when Anna wasn't busy with her voluminous correspondence, teaching, doing everything she was going to give talks at Chautauquas, institutes, and she was an editor. First, she was a contributing editor for Nature Study Review, and then its sole editor, which was a daunting amount of work for her. Liberty Hyde Bailey started Country Life in America. He was the one who began this journal, this publication, and he had Anna be the poetry editor for this. And if you've read any of Anna's work, that makes perfect sense to you, because all of her writings are very much a melding of science with literary aesthetics. She wrote in a very lyrical way. And often there's poetry in her work. When Anna retired at age 65, although as you saw from that piece of correspondence I showed you, she didn't really retire. Faculty of Agriculture at Cornell recognized her by passing a resolution which said in part that she mastered the work of art engraving and gained place of honor among the artists, which she surely did, that her work with the pen was, meaning her authorship, was even more remarkable, and they mentioned her nature study work, the vision she provided for that, and not only the zeal and industry she put into it, but the practical results, which you saw played out in her lifetime in this representation across the US in our public school curricula. The following year, remember Martha Van Rensselaer that I mentioned with the woodblock print that was given to her? Anna in 1923 was named one of the 12 greatest living women by the League of Women Voters, along with Martha Van Rensselaer. And she wrote a charming letter that I didn't want to include because I was worried about timing, but about how flabbergasted she was. She really thought it was a mistake. She said it had to have been some other Comstock lady. Couldn't have been her. 5 years later, in 1928, the Comstocks celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in October. Happened to coincide beautifully with the 4th International Congress of Entomology that was held in Ithaca. And this photo of the Comstocks on the right appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, which was reporting on ice that year. The following year, the students of Cornell dedicated the yearbook to the Comstocks, noting their open home and helpful hearts. And indeed, when you read about Anna, you know how dedicated she was to students. The house was always open to them. And this was noted in a newspaper clipping after her death, her influence on undergraduates. And it was said to have gone to Cornell and not to have known Mrs. Comstock was to have missed the greatest advantages that the university had to offer. That same year in 1929, Liberty Hyde Bailey and his wife donated a tract of land on Cayuga Lake in the hope that they would, to the Girl Scouts, in hope that they would do something to honor Anna's nature study work, and indeed they did. That lower right is a picture from this summer. The Comstock Program Center is there in her name. When she died in 1930, this newspaper clipping attests to her indomitable spirit and dedication. She had been failing in health for more than a year, but had just completed 2 weeks before her death a series of talks for the summer session students. Now, what I've done here is arrange on, trying to be scientific here, an XY axis of Anna's works. So if you start at the x-axis down at around 1880, that's her first publication. Moving on, as you can see, is starting off as an illustrator, as one who drew and then engraved, and moving out into the nature study movement, where she's her own author, a single author, and editor and professor. Now, I didn't mention in the upper very center, in 1906, she also published, how she did this, I don't know, also published a novel, Confessions to a Heathen Idol. You can get this as a PDF for free online. And it did very well. Doubleday sold this, and she first published it under a pseudonym, and then she went ahead and published it under her own name. She was worried that as a scientist, it wouldn't look proper for her to have written a novel. In her lifetime, Anna earned many and was recognized in many, many ways, as you see here. In 1930, just a few months before her death, she was granted an honorary doctor degree from Hobart College. And then posthumously, all sorts of buildings were named for her and or her husband. And one on the William Smith College's campus is named for her. In 1988, she was an inductee into the Conservation Hall of Fame of the National Wildlife Federation. She is now one of, if their website's accurate, one of 4 women and 28 men. We're talking people like John James Audubon, Aldo Leopold. We, historians, not me, historians, trace Anna's legacy in many ways today through Edith Patch, the first woman president of ESA in 1930, who knew Anna personally and studied with the Comstocks and dedicated this book on nature study for children to Anna. And to Rachel Carson, who Rachel Carson's biographer has written that Rachel's mother read Anna's nature study work to her as a child. Not to mention Gertrude Warren, who is considered the mother of 4-H. Gertrude studied under Anna and is credited with coming up with the name 4-H. Historians certainly recognize Anna as a pioneer of elementary school science, and they trace this nature study movement in the teaching of ecology. For example, in this recent book by historian Kevin Armitage, The Nature Study Movement, he recognizes the impact of nature study as foundational to environmental education and ideologies such as deep ecology that we're familiar with today. So, if you happen to be in New York, near Otto, you can still see Anna's home that they moved to when she was 13 years old, and they have a historical marker there. On the Cornell campus, you can't, everything is Comstock there, I think. In the upper left, you see what they called, the Comstocks called the chalet. This was the building they built largely with proceeds from nature study, by the way, Handbook of Nature Study. The Cornell Publishing Company, or excuse me, Comstock Publishing Company, which would become Cornell Publishing, and you see it in the upper right as it is today. That's the Comstock standing in front of the gate at 124 Roberts Place. And of course, there's Anna Comstock Hall on the Cornell campus. It's now the Latino Learning Community. Right across the street from that chalet is this home that's in the upper right. This is the second home they lived in, the Comstocks. They called it the Ledge. It overlooks Fall Creek. And if you look in the lower right, that post is still there. This post they had erected to hold a sundial that John Henry carried back when he and Anna were vacationing in England. And so it got posted there. And in the upper left, you're seeing Anna in her 65th birthday sitting in front of that sundial. And that's her watercolor in the center. Those at Cornell know Cornell Plantations and Comstock Knoll. This was named for both John and Anna. And the upper left there is a plaque indicating that. And on the right is the path leading up to the knoll. It's beautiful. You can, on the Cornell campus, see the sesquicentennial grove, where they have these slabs of granite with quotes by famous Cornellians. You can see the one here by Anna, where she credits Cornell for having taught her religious tolerance. And if you sit on that, you'll be sitting on a quote by President Andrew White. Seems appropriate. And if you venture down into the town of Ithaca, you can visit the First Unitarian Society there and see a stained glass window, the triptych here, that was put in honor of Anna. You see her in nature surrounded by children. There's even a children's book written about Anna Botsford Comstock. And it has a quote in there from her autobiography that reads, "One of my joys of childhood was going barefoot from early spring until late autumn." Excuse me. Now, Anna loved nature in all of its creatures and certainly insects, but kids, of course, still today who love bugs can be the brunt of teasing, as was the case with Sophia Spencer here. And her plight went viral under the hashtag #BugsAreForGirls. Well, Sophia is now the co-author of a publication in Annals on her love of bugs. These days, concerns are being raised about the fact that children don't spend a lot of time outside in nature, and when they do, it's not unstructured playtime. And these two books, Last Child in the Woods and How to Raise a Wild Child, review the increasing literature on the value and benefits to children of having unstructured playtime out of doors. I think if Anna were with us today, she would be a leader of what might be a new nature study movement. So, thank you to the ECP committee of the ESA who nominated myself and Anna for this wonderful award. Professor Mariana Federica Wolfner, whom I just got to meet. She reached out to me, a total stranger. Thank you. And the Rare and Manuscripts Collections at Cornell. I have to acknowledge the historical work of two friends and colleagues of mine, the late Ed Smith at Cornell, who was chair, of course, and head professor there for many years. He did research on Anna Botsford, as did Pam Henson, a Smithsonian historian. So their research guided my own. And my former advisor for my master's and PhD, Stanley Friedman, who just passed away a few months ago. Stanley tolerated my many forays into the history of entomology, and somehow I managed to get through graduate school. I every day think about how wonderful he was as a mentor. And I have to thank my parents, because they thought the best place for a kid was out of doors. I don't think I'd be standing here today if it weren't for them. And they raised a girl who loved bugs and who really enjoyed raising caterpillars in old canning jars, something I continue to do to this day. I'll end with this, a quote from the trustees and faculty of Cornell University when Anna passed. And they said of Anna, to generations of students, she will continue to be an inspiring example. I hope I have done my job for the ESA of representing Anna as a very deserving person as a founder, to be named a founder for our discipline and our society. And the quote was, to generations of students, she will continue to be an inspiring example. So that seemed to tie in very nicely with the theme that Susan chose. So we hope we've ignited you with this breakfast. You're inspired, and you're going to go out there and innovate just like Anna. So thanks so much.